Welcome to our second session of our Bible study of the Lord's Prayer. And as we get into the class today, I want to admit that it is not easy to prepare for these types of classes. And for a while, I was like, come on, it's so simple. It's just you're covering like two phrases. But the thing is, and we touched on this last week, when especially in Matthew's version, when you read the Lord's Prayer, when you really get into it, when it really has a poetic, it's like a hymn. And so in much the same way as a poem or a hymn, one word will refer to so many different possibilities, and so it'll strike so many chords of memory and connection to other scriptures and deeper meaning, that it can lead you down many different rabbit holes. Okay, so I just want to say from the outset, my intention with this class and with all of these classes is not to try to get tied up into being completely comprehensive in my approach, but to give us what I think are some solid, digestible, chewable, fascinating possibilities and connectors, and then allow it to sort of engender the conversation that it does, and then also for each of you to continue your own investigations, because it's so rich, it'd be almost tedious to try to do it all. So that's the intention and the approach. Marilyn, I see your hand up.
Dan, I just want to reassure you about the particular approach that you do and that you have taken, because I'll tell you, every single class is just full of things I have never thought about before. Even though it's something so, that I've said again and again and again, like the Lord's Prayer. So
Yeah.
I think the approach that you're taking is just wonderful. I'm glad you're not being comprehensive. I can fill in the comprehensive part.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you for saying that, for sure, because we're trying to do it in a way that's meeting the needs of those of you who are participating now, but also thinking about those that just sort of jump in, who haven't been a part of these groups, who don't have the context. So I like to just sort of provide that for anyone that happens to be watching, so that they can sort of feel and express eventually maybe what you just said. That the intention of these is not to ever say, okay, this is what it means, folks. This is what it means singularly. No, because it really very rarely do these texts that we've been studying function like that. So I don't try to force fit it. So that's just going to be a part of that. That's the part that has been, and it will continue to be a part of how we do.
Dan, you've taught us to examine all our thoughts and our readings as if it doesn't ever always mean just this.
Exactly.
That's that expansive position. Yeah. And I love what Marilyn said, and I'll rephrase it and say, I can find my own rabbit holes.
There you go. That's it.
to follow endlessly into places and thoughts. And I like us keeping focused on a lot of the emotional content, what this brings up for us, what each part takes us to each time we say it. Where do we go? What are the places of comfort that we remember, of remembering others or trespasses or debts or temptations or whatever. But keeping it really, really highly personal, because it is something that so many of us participate in so often, that to really delve into that personal relationship with this text is really wonderful.
Yes. So we will be touching on that. So the way that this prayer and these texts for today do impact us on a personal level and on a larger level. And then to me, just in general, good Bible study is about helping us understand, oh, this is the tool I've been using to do Bible study, or to consider the Bible. So maybe I've been taught, and I've always used a shovel when I dig in the soil of the Bible. But good Bible study will teach us maybe to use a trowel, or a spoon, or maybe even a toothpick, or something larger. The point is to see a little bit more clearly the tools that we've been using, and then the way we've connected those with our understanding and our appreciation, and just to allow ourselves more diversity. So thank you. I appreciate the fact that you understand this, but I want anyone who's watching this to understand the same, for sure.
Dan, I always think of debt as money.
Well, we'll be getting to debt and yeah, exactly. A lot of us do. And I want to say that debt does have to do with money. Absolutely. But it's more than just money. Okay. And when we get to that phrase, we'll be talking about how that correlates to the broader understanding and functioning of the ancient Israelite society. Okay. But that's for another class. Gosh, that's a couple sessions away yet. But for today, we're talking about the phrasings, our Father, or our Father in heaven, and hallowed be your name, or hallowed be thy name. Okay. So as we get into this, there's a number of folks, and I remember in seminary and a number of lay people too, when we consider that opening to the prayer, there's a lot of people, even if you've been raised in the church, and even if you've kind of been taught and you understand things a little bit, there's still that wondering that a lot of people have is why give in this most important and greatest prayer within our tradition? Why the need to use a name like Father? A male-oriented name. That is something that people ask questions about. Why have a name like that? The task of today, or part of what we'll do, is look at that a little bit. Look at what it is, why we have that as a descriptor for God. Okay, what Jesus was talking about, what our understanding and what the biblical tradition, just in that particular name for God. Why is that there? Why do we need to have any title for the divine? That's another good question. But we're also going to consider, how that term, what meaning that term had in Jesus' day, the understanding of the word Father. And then as we get to the other part, the hallowed be your name, there's a foundational story that is the initial way that sort of Israel kind of understood God's name as being holy. And does anyone happen to know or have an idea do you remember the story? And it's an Old Testament story that had to do with the initial way that we understood that God's name is holy. It has to do with Moses. Bonnie?
I'm not going to get this right, but I know it had something to do with like holy ground, like you're standing on holy ground.
Yes.
And I don't know if it was the burning bush or
Yes.
it was some other story. Okay.
That's it. You nailed it. Good job. Okay. But that's it. That was the initial. Yes. Congratulations. You get a star. The burning bush story is such a crucial, powerful story that shows us so much about the naming of God and why naming and what that looks like, but also what God's holiness looks like, and just the way that that's all expressed, and then what's also not said. And then there's another part that I think really is very teachable for us as an ancient story. And again, there's many, but one I chose today comes from Leviticus, that really gives us an orientation as to what holiness looks like. And it's Leviticus chapter 19. We're going to be looking at these, so don't worry. I'm not just going to throw out a bunch of scriptures and leave you hanging. But so Leviticus, this particular passage is called the Holiness Code. And it really goes into talking about, be holy because I, your God, am holy. Okay, so it really goes into very specific detail in very, ritualistic priestly language, but that's okay. But it gives us a real insight to, I think, help us see some of the richness that we can unpack from that simple phrase, hallowed be your name, okay? The last thing I want to say by way of introduction has to do with the whole prayer itself. And it's something that I didn't even notice until I looked at the actual words and the structure of this prayer. And that is, when we say this every week, it's beautiful, it's powerful, it's meaningful when we say it aloud. But until I actually looked at it, I didn't notice a parallel structure here. And I want to show you what I'm talking about. So let's see if I can minimize okay, now can everyone see this all right? Mm-hmm. So this is a simple way of organizing the prayer, okay? And it's it's set up basically in two halves. Okay, so there's 3 points that initially pertain to God, who is said to be in the heavens, and then the next three, the last three, have to do with humanity and our place here on earth. Okay, so it starts off with these simple phrasings: "Your name be hallowed, your kingdom come, your will be done, as it is in heaven on earth." And then that's what moves us then into these next three: "Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Do not lead us into temptation. Rescue us from the evil one." What becomes interesting, and I think even apparent, that others have suggested as well, is that there's this invites us into reflection on how all these interact. If you link them up, they almost amplify. One amplifies the other. So we're going to be kind of looking at that, but I want you to consider, even as you look at this, maybe for the first time, to say, all right, your name be hallowed. How might giving us our daily bread, the providing of daily bread, represent the hallowing of God's name? Your kingdom come. How might the forgiveness of debt and our forgiveness of one another relate to God's kingdom coming? You see how this works. And what scholars have noted is that when you set the prayer side by side like this, you start to see how, wow, one side can't really function fully without the other. That as we say these things, can we say these things of God? And can we say that they might happen without us? Can what we say about us on the right side, can it happen without God? The question is, can either half of the Lord's Prayer, I got out of it, can either half of the Lord's Prayer stand alone? This is part of the reflection that we'll be doing today, of course, but throughout the whole class, is recognizing how these things correlate, because there's an enmeshing of these two. It's not just, okay, God, you do this and we'll do this. It's much more than that, much more interactive than that. Okay, so that's the setup. I know it's a lot, but you've already begun to engage some questions. Are there any other questions or comments related on maybe what I just said, or any other things that have come up? Carol.
Would you be sure and include that in the notes that you send?
Oh, it'll be in the notes. It's in there. Yes, absolutely. Bonnie?
What you just posted, I've always thought of this as more of a personal prayer. Like, I should be forgiving others. If I want people, like God has forgiven me, I should forgive others. But when I first looked at that, I thought this could be a much broader meaning than just individual. I mean, you could use it for our nation. You could use it for, our church. You could use it in many other ways that would encompass more than just the individual.
Yeah, you're onto something, Bonnie. And it's funny because even when we say this prayer in church on a corporate level, we often think about this as a me thing, my relationship, with God. And that is something that, to me, the prayer could not be more clear about. And we'll get to that. Marilyn?
Well, I've been thinking a little bit more about our Father, addressing God that way. First of all, Father implies relationship.
Yes.
All of us have a father, whether that father is around, whether that father's alive, or whatever. We all have a father, or we wouldn't exist. And then, so that implies relationship. And then the pronoun our, we don't say my Father who art in heaven. We say our Father who art in heaven, which implies a real breadth to who is welcome to say this prayer.
Absolutely. And we will look at both of those in a little bit more detail, but you're really naming sort of the the outline, the nuts and bolts of what is trying to be said with those two little first words. Okay. Actually, in Matthew, the Greek that we translate our Father is literally Father of us. Okay, Father of all of us. And in Luke, it's just Father. Okay, but it's this the greater understanding with our Father is that it's much more than my Father, and it's much more than my literal earthly father. Because too often, when I think we have concern about the naming of God in language like this, some of the challenge can be the associations we make with our own earthly father and then kind of putting some of those qualities on God. It's not asking us to do that, but we'll be looking at that somewhat. But thank you. Any other kind of initial comments or reflections? Horty and then Bertie?
Along with what Marilyn was verbalizing, starting with our, it's always seemed to me that brings the entire universe of people into relationship. There's no one that's outside of our. It's not directed anywhere, but it's directed at absolutely everyone. And I think of Father as a term that comes from that time, that was the highest honor maybe that could be given, and the idea of source of all, our DNA as well as provision, at least in that time historically. I'm sure there was that expectation of that role. And in addition to holy meaning sacred or like that, holy has often meant to me whole, meaning complete. And so hallowed be thy name has also always meant to me wholeness is everything you are, because naming something is really about helping to identify the essence.
Yes.
So holy is your name is, for me, has always also been totally holy, whole, not just hallowed, but whole is thy name, which is the essence of everything you are.
Yes, that sense of wholeness, that sense of completeness is what is often referred to when we see in the New Testament, in particular, where there's the Greek translation perfect. Be perfect as your Father is perfect. It really is trying to convey, be whole, be complete as your Father is complete. It's much different because we get hung up on words like perfect. Oh my gosh, we go into perfectionism, and that's not at all what it's ever trying to talk about. It's trying to talk about fulfillment, wholeness, completeness, connection to our truth, our deeper purposes, all of these things. All of that is conveyed in this one little prayer. Okay, and we will touch on all of those things, the issue, considerations of holiness, what that means, our Father, all this. But if we don't have, Bertie, you had your hand up.
Yes, Jesus says, "Our Father, it's in heaven," and so heaven is God's kingdom, and Jesus also tells us that God's kingdom is within us.
Yes.
So that means we're not praying to somebody who's just out there. We're praying to somebody who's right with us. Exactly.
And to name that initial space of God is not to allocate God exclusively there, as you just beautifully said. It's sort of to acknowledge that God is the God of all of it. We say words like cosmos, universe, all of it, beyond anything, So God of the beyond, who is also within, that's what's being referenced here. And by extension, consider this. If we then are those of earth, but God is also within us, that connects us to something much greater. Okay, so there's all of this interaction. That's the key. It's not what this prayer is asking of us is not to sort of say, okay, that's where God is. That's what God does. This is where we are. This is what we do. We go there. We do, because this is how we act with some of these rich poetic texts like this. We try to destroy them. I think it's who was the poet laureate? Billy, darn it. I forget his name, Billy something, but he had this great poem about when we try to make meaning from poetry and we squeeze the meaning out of it and thereby just destroy it all. It's just like, it's a beautiful thing. And I ruined it by trying to remember his name. But anyway, someone's
Billy Collins.
Billy Collins, that's it. Yes. But it's a, so anyway, he talks about that. And that is our tendency with scripture, with poetry, with beauty, is to try to squeeze our meaning out of it. And with the English language being so precise as it is, it's very easy to do that, okay? Because we miss how all the different threads from each word connect to different meanings in different contexts. But anyway, so let's begin today then, just by looking at a few different translations of these verses for today. Not going to take long. I'll just read them because it's just a little simpler this way. Because they're not, like I said, they're not long. And this, I'm going to focus on the Matthew one because it's just a little bit more poetic. And I was able to find from Patty, who I didn't see yet in class today, but she provided me this one. And I have the book that is on the bottom there called Prayers of the Cosmos. And it's an Aramaic version of this Greek. So anyway, in our New Revised Standard, we see, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Okay, very familiar, perhaps not as familiar as the King James Version, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And then there's Eugene Peterson in his own way doing a paraphrase. That's the Message. Our Father in heaven, reveal who you are. Again, a poet interpreting poetry. It's beautiful. It's different, okay? It's not literal, but he really gets underneath these words. I love what he does with this prayer. And then this Aramaic version from the Prayers of the Cosmos. O thou, the breathing life of all, creator of the shimmering sound that touches us. Help us breathe one holy breath, feeling only you. This creates a shrine inside, in wholeness. I love that. And yes, it's poetic. Yes, it's way longer, but it also touches on what I was trying to say and what a lot of you have noted, that to say hallowed doesn't just mean one thing. It has to do with that richness, that the creation of a sense of shrine within us and around us, the creation of a sense of wholeness. And it speaks to those things. That's why it's so much longer, because I think it's trying to address all of that richness in the original, from the original Greek. So, all right. So, and again, I don't know, let's see, you just saw those. I can include that information actually, if you'd like it, with the notes. I'll make sure to include that. But let's get into it a little bit. I want to allow others to kind of jump in on what some have already touched on. This whole idea, let's start with Father. And the idea of, maybe some of us have ever felt tripped up by that reference to Father, and and it's worth considering why or why not. We've talked about a couple reasons, but I want you to consider how the term Father might actually be considered an inclusive term, not a specific male term, but an inclusive term. How might it be inclusive? Bob?
Before we,
You bounced out. You're muted again. There you go.
the thought crossed my mind that Jesus was male, and he was also considered rabbi, and rabbis were all male. Is that correct?
I don't know if all rabbis were male. I believe that is true, at least for the time, because most women were not literate, but there were a number who were. So I can't say definitively. I believe that's right in the day of Jesus, the time of Jesus, that the rabbis were men. And certainly Jesus' relationship as son to father was trying to communicate something. But I want to say, is it an exclusive thing? Is that really that God is just Father, that God is Father? Or does the word Father convey something more than the maleness of Father? And when you look at certain texts, and many texts in the Old Testament, you will find reference to the fact that the word father is a much broader term than the man of the family, the male head of the family. Because many instances where you'll see father or brethren, like in Acts, the beginning of Acts, when Peter refers to the brethren, the word father includes men and women, or you could say father and mother. It includes that, it assumes it. And you can get this from different contexts. And I provide some texts from Proverbs, from Sirach, which is also called Ecclesiasticus, and then Acts. I include a few texts. There's many. But there are times when maleness is specific to maleness. But when it comes to God, it's much more often metaphorical. And so there are ample examples within our tradition of times where the word father is used, and it conveys that broader understanding of not just father, but more like parent, and more than just parent, even more than parent, but just one who is overwatching. And that's why we have so many words, because there isn't just one that captures it. Okay, so to call Jesus, or to call God Father in this is not intended to say, well, God is Father. Okay, God has many names. God has many names, and this is a way of understanding relationship. Now, that's one example of how the word father can be more inclusive. And again, that's from text. But can you think of other ways that the word father might be considered to be inclusive? Yes, Jay.
Couldn't you just as easily use the word creator?
You can, but there's a real intention with the word father. And so it's an invitation to go there, that what does the word father convey that creator doesn't necessarily convey? Because that is an important piece. Boyce and then Barbara?
Well, two things. Father to me is a much more deep relationship than if you said things like creator or God or whatever. It's almost like, oh, it's something way out there somewhere. But Father, that brings it home. That brings it to your heart.
Yes.
It's a relationship, a personal relationship.
That's it.
And
Yeah.
I think that the word our also implies it's everybody's. It's not just mine. It's everybody's.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. Barbara, did you want to add anything to that before I make comments?
Well, I think Boyce said it all, but I'll also say that the word our encompasses the whole cosmos and doesn't just include humans.
Yes, exactly. It truly would be all of creation. And I'll get to that too. Bonnie, I see your hand up.
When I think of my father, I think of the protector, the provider. He was the one that cared for me. And even as I got older, that never really left. He was still always sort of hovering about.
Mm-hmm.
But provider, protectors, that's the first thing that popped in my mind.
And that's really good. That's a good segue almost, because there's one more thing I want to say about the idea of family in ancient Israel. But that idea of father conveying protector, provider is really, really a good one. Okay, I'll come back to that in a second. But what I do want to say is that when you understand, when you get into family, ancient Israel family, we have to notice something. Family in ancient Israel is not the nuclear family of today. It is not these little micro houses that are set apart where we have father, mother, or father only or mother only, and then kids, and that's it. No. The understanding of family was way bigger. Okay, so it might be brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, uncles, married ones, unmarried ones, slaves, women and men slaves. It had to do with cattle or livestock. It had to do with your land. It even included your tools. It included such a wide array of understanding for this idea of family itself. So even the word family and to call God the Father over this larger family, I just want to communicate, and you've said this, there's a broadness of association there in what the family is. And as has also been said, this idea of the word our, that simple little word, really conveys so much. And we've started to address this, but why do you think we say, well, you've really said it. There's a reason why we say our Father and not my Father, okay? Because this is about something way bigger than me, way bigger than each one of us. There's a connection here to this broader family, this broader community. And also to say our Father, it harkens back to that beautiful language. Gosh, was that from the Psalms? It might have been, no, it was from one of the prophets, I believe. But this idea of that before we knew it, I mean, this sounds like Psalm 139. Before we knew God chose us. God first loved us. That the creator of all that is somehow chose to be known to us. And so to call God our Father is also to acknowledge that we don't possess God. It's not our God, although we act like that. We make Christianity, we make our religions that way. But the intention of the our is much bigger. It's to acknowledge that we refer now to the one who existed before us and who first chose and loved us, that we might step into our fullness as God's fullness is slowly revealed in our midst. So the hour is it's a very personal prayer, but it's not personal just like me in private. It's personal as a sense of connection to the collective. Okay, we pray this by ourselves, but we're never alone when we pray it. Comments on that, Horty?
In using our, there is, and I like Barbara's use of the word cosmos, there is nothing to which we are no longer connected. Not the terrorists, not anybody. We are connected to everybody, and that claims that. And it always gives me a sense of humility that there is no one on this earth. There is, and again, back to Barbara's word of cosmos, but particularly there's no one on this earth that I'm not connected to that's not part of our, no matter what country, what belief system, what political system, what sort of activity they're partaking in that I find anathema. We're still connected. We're still our.
Yeah. And that may not sound like what you just said is so beautiful and powerful, and it may not sound so radical to us, but to many within Christianity, to say something like that is a quite radical statement, because there are many traditions within Christianity that sort of view the Lord's Prayer as a litmus test for your Christian credentials, almost like a creed, but not exactly, but something we say that is our prayer. That's what makes us different, kind of thing. And really, this prayer is inviting maybe a different reflection, that because Jesus never came, you know, we just studied the Gospel of Mark. Jesus was not coming to start a new religion. He wasn't coming to set people apart. He was coming to bring people together and to wholeness. And yes, meeting people individually and inviting them on their own journey was a big part of it, but never for their own sake. The rich young ruler could know all the commandments and do all the best practices, but unless his soil led him to go and serve and to give and to feed the poor and to take care of others, he missed it. So it never is about us. It can start with us, but it's never just about us. And it invites us to this broader understanding of our connection, as Horty and others have said, not just to humanity, but to all things. And that there's never a disconnection, however often we seek to create those. And that's really how it's happened. We've kind of created these divisions.
And it also creates a connection that we can't shrug. or we can't be away from. We are included. That's an ourness, that's a given. We can't just say them, they, the cosmos, because we've said our, we've claimed our responsibility in that too.
Ideally, yes. We can't shrug it, but how often we do, and that's a later conversation too, as we kind of come maybe to just thinking about how this prayer challenges us, what it asks of us, what it lays out, and then how we actually are living into the promises, not only that God has made to us, but we have made back to God. I saw another hand. Was it Bonnie? Yeah.
This is a side story, but I've done some reading about the Salem witch trials, and that was when you mentioned a litmus test. It was believed that a witch would not be able to recite the Lord's Prayer. And so that was one of the things when they put these people on trial, and there was actually a minister that was killed, that was hung, that recited the Lord's Prayer during his execution or whatever, or just before, but that was the litmus test. If you were a witch, you wouldn't know the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah, and this is what we've done with religion. This is why it's such a double-edged sword. Religion at its best can liberate the human spirit. It can strengthen the family of all, and again, not just humanity, but of all creation. But too often we've used it as a weapon to divide, to create insiders and outsiders. And it's just like, what? We're missing it. And there's so many examples like what Bonnie said, where we take what we think are the intentions and we really pervert them, and we use them according to our own desires. We cast God in our own image. And this prayer is asking us and reminding us that that is never how we roll. We start with the holy. We see what the holy is, and then we model ourselves after that. That's what we're called to do. But so often we do flip it. We do flip it. Some of you have talked about this, about the idea, okay, so Father communicates a lot. And one of the ways of considering Father is maybe as provider or protector, or even a word that some scholars use is householder. Okay, householder of the earth. And when I use that term, I mean, it's a very, very common theme, again, especially in the prophets, but even in the Gospel of Mark. Remember that parable of the vineyard and the tenants, and that sense that parable conveyed of God, the vineyard owner, and the care of the creation and the crops and the fruit, and how it was meant to serve everybody. And then people started to pervert it, and God kept sending people to help. And you may remember the story. And the people, the tenants of the vineyard, kept killing all these people because they weren't living according to the ways that God, saw as being the ways. So this whole idea of the householder of the earth is a very powerful way of considering, the relationship of God to each one of us, and what might be really being conveyed in that word that is simply translated as Father. So that idea, if God is considered that householder, that provider, that protector, does that open up? Does it change the role? Does it change your understanding of this prayer at all? Or does it change the role that you understand God to have in the world if you think of God not just as Father, but as householder of the earth? Or is that something that you've kind of, I've sort of already embodied that in my way of thinking about God? Is that a familiar feeling term? Just any reflections that people have, do you find that to be a challenging term, or is it feeling familiar and like, yes, or no, maybe like, yeah, I don't really resonate with that. Go ahead, Marilyn.
For me, it's kind of just the opposite. I think one of the things I struggled with those 40 years when I wasn't going to church was that I just couldn't see that somebody who thought just like I did and was very much like me could be all there is.
Mm.
I just saw so much power and riches and everything in the different ways people were.
Yes.
And that included when I'd study about Hinduism or Buddhism, or I would just see things there that I had never seen before. And so I couldn't go along with exclusivity.
Yes. What you just named, I would call your prophetic eye, because to me, you just spoke what the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Micah, okay, spoke to, because they saw a world full of riches, but it was riches for a few and then the rest getting screwed. And so that's why we see through the prophets and throughout the tradition, there's this focus from God on these categories of people. Okay. And there's primarily three, but so categories of people like the poor and needy. Why is God so concerned about the poor and needy? Because just like Marilyn noted in her modern experience of the world, we live in a world of riches, but these riches are not distributed fairly. They're distributed in a way that too often it's just for the few, and then other people are lacking so much. And it hits us in the heart if we let it. A lot of us get numb to it because it's hard to process, but we live in a world that has enough production of food that there need not be any hunger. And yet what do we see? Not only around the world, but in this country, we see devastating poverty. Okay, so there's one of the categories that God is focused on as far as what is, as the householder, that's what God is concerned about, that there's this sense of enough and sharing and fairness. Okay, another group that's often focused on is the widows and the orphans. They are named all the time throughout the prophetic tradition, in the Psalms, always a special concern of God on people like that. Now, where would that come from? Well, in a patriarchal society, which was really the way, women and children did not have the same access to power. And so there had to be this special concern for widows and orphans. And then another category had to do with resident aliens. There is a concern of welcoming the stranger and caring for the aliens among us, because we used to be aliens too. Constantly said, okay? Constantly said, because when you live in a tribal world like they did, it was too easy to create insiders and outsiders. And in many ways, we are still just as tribal today as we ever have been. So this sense of God as being that householder for the earth is more helpful, because I think it broadens our appreciation of what the intentions of this prayer are. It is not a prayer for me and mine that we would be blessed by God and that our lives might then bless God, because blessing God doesn't happen through me to God. How do we bless God? We'll get to that. That's Leviticus 19. Okay, you've started to touch on it. But how do we bless God? Well, it's not by just paying lip service to God. You read the scriptures, you see that God doesn't tend to like lip service. God likes justice. God likes caring for those who have not. God likes a world that actually looks like the world that God intended. Okay, this is what's being said in this prayer. Okay, when we say, holy is your name, that's what's being asked of us. This is a question I had later, but when we think of God's name, when we think of a name, not the literal name, this isn't about the burning bush part, we'll get to that, but when you think of someone's name, what does that bring up? What do you think of when we say someone, when we talk about someone's name? What are some descriptors of what that conveys? Carol?
Your name is your identity.
That's it.
And I remember growing up, no one could ever spell my last name. It was Wells, but it had an extra E in it. And I used to get so upset when people would not honor my name and the way it was supposed to be spelled.
Yeah. Yeah. It's part of your identity, for sure. Your name. What else is a name? Beautiful. Horty?
I think of it as a representation of your totality, more than just your identity, your exterior face or participation, but sort of boil down to the total essence of everything that you are and hope to have ever stood for in your life.
Okay, that you said a lot there. Okay, so a name has to do with your character. It's deep character, though. It's not just a surface title. It's a way of being in the world. The name conveys your reputation. How many of you ever got that conversation with your parents that said, hey, you got to represent the family name when you do this kind of thing? That has to do with our reputation. It's not just about pride. Sometimes it is about pride, and we don't want to be seen as, failing in society or looking bad or whatever. No. It's often way more than that. It has to do with character, has to do with reputation, has to do with just the way we are in the world. That's who we are. You're a Wells, okay? You're a whatever, Spacek, any of your last names. It conveys something more than a title. Okay, so God's name, when we talk about God's name, it does have to do with God's name being a model for us of how to be in the world. And that the stuff God cares about, we better care about. That's how it's set up. That's how it's always set up. We don't just look at God and God is this, okay? No, it's and we're going to see it in Leviticus 19. God is this, so we be this. That's what is communicated here. So the name of God is not just about a title. It's about a way of being. It conveys something of God's character. And it asks us to then model our character, our way of living in the world, our identity after that name. That's big. That's much bigger. We're not just addressing God here. We're making a statement about the one with whom we walk and the way we walk in the world. Questions or comments about that? Okay. All right. Oh, I wanted to say, to connect it to our last class, to Mark's gospel. When we went through Mark's gospel, we saw how, the fullness of faith and the power of Jesus was never something that was communicated through him alone. Okay, so the metaphor of seed and soil, that it was always this interaction between Jesus and the one with whom he connected, as to the seed either bearing fruit in that particular soil or not. It was never a one-way street. Jesus never wielded power that way. Okay. And that the fruition came only through this interactive, collaborative effort. And I'm saying in our conversation so far, the Lord's Prayer articulates something similar. Mm-hmm. Do you see that? Do you agree with that? Or how so? How does it communicate that? And how do you feel about that? Do you think, is there a part of you that says, yeah, that's the way it works? Or, oh, that feels presumptuous to say that God really doesn't wield power without us? That's basically what Mark was saying. God's power is not power over, it's power with. That's what Mark was communicating. And I contend that this prayer is communicating something similar. Comments? Horty?
The power within. Do unto the least of these, my brethren, mm-hmm. as you have then done it unto me. Mm-hmm. And that's, I believe, how we demonstrate our caring of, about, and for God, is in our outreach into this earth, this planet, that reality with which we've been given.
I want to make sure everyone heard the way you just phrased that. The way we show our care for God is to care for one another. That might sum up the entire biblical record. Our love for God is communicated through our love for each other. It's not only a one-way street. We have a relationship with God, our prayer lives, the sacredness of different moments, our sense of gratitude. There is so much that directly communicates with God, that's not necessarily directed at a human being or a resident of creation, directly, but where God is found, where God is loved, where God is cared for, happens in and amongst us. And again, that's when you go back and look at the prayer, itself, read the whole thing, and yeah, you see that. That's what it's about. It's about simple things like daily bread and forgiveness. And not just forgiveness in our heart, but forgiveness of debts, forgiveness of the stuff, so that there's a setting right here. And then a living out of God's will by not falling into temptation and self-serving stuff. And that's where evil comes from. See, it's kind of inviting us into that space. Very similar in that way to the whole approach of Mark's gospel. Yes, Bob.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You just made me realize something different I hadn't thought of before when we say, give us our daily bread. That I always think of just give me my bread. And now you're conveying it's meant in a form of community.
Yeah. Beautiful. Because even though we say the words, give us this day our daily bread, I think more of us than not hear that as, give me what I need for today, and help me be okay with that. And that's enough. I think there's more being said. Horty?
But we've also, at the beginning of the prayer, said, our Father. How can us not refer to what we referred to in our? Give
Right.
us our daily bread has got to be the entirety of what we called our community, family, cosmos at the beginning of the prayer.
Right. We have to stay connected to the fact that this is a collective prayer. But I guess what we're acknowledging is that when we say it, we still often, we just don't go to that place. We stay in ourselves a lot of times when we think about this, when we pray this. And again, there's nothing wrong. It is partly about ourselves, yes, but it just doesn't stop there. It's much broader than that. There's this us, there's this our, and it's a bigger our than maybe we'd ever thought before. And we can see how it connects to the stories of the tradition that point us in that direction, but we often forget, or we weren't taught that, or we just didn't somehow, it just didn't sink in. And so the way we use this prayer, the way we hear it when we say it, is often quite different than the way we've just been talking about it in these last 50 or so minutes. And that's the invitation, is to say, wow, this is a bigger prayer than I'd given it credit for before, or than, I thought I understood that bigness, but now I'm seeing it's bigger still. And to allow ourselves to go there. So let's take a look at, oh, go ahead, Margaret. Unmute. Let me see here if I can help. Can you hit the button, Margaret? It wasn't letting me unmute.
She can try lower left screen.
If you press the space bar on your computer, it will unmute you, Margaret.
Yeah, all I can do is ask to unmute. I don't know why. Okay, did you hit it? Hit the space bar, Margaret.
She needs to hold it, keep it held down.
Oh, hold it down, I guess. Okay. Is that working? No, you're still muted, and I can't unmute you. I wish I could. It's funny. I think I can do it sometimes, and it's not letting me today.
Margaret, do you see the little microphone down at the bottom? Put your cursor down to the lower left, and there should be a little microphone. And if you click on that, that line should go away, and then you'll be unmuted.
Because we really want to hear you, Margaret. It's funny, it lets me mute all, and it doesn't let me unmute all. All right. Well, unfortunately, if we can't, if you get yourself in a spot, Margaret, I'm going to come back to you.
Okay, can you hear
Oh,
me
there you
now?
are. Yep. Yes, we got you.
Anyway, I was just going to say, you just blew my mind out of this prayer, how much difference the meanings is.
Mhm.
I have it was my prayer, I mean to God. And here you are expanding so many. I just never thought of that. So thank you.
Well, and this is how it so often works, isn't it? And it is a very personal prayer. It's a very, it's a deep prayer. And so to pray it is a personal experience, but it's just not private. It's communal. It's still
I get
personal,
it.
but it's communal. Yeah. So that's great. And to open us up is only going to enrich and deepen not only our connection with this prayer, but with our own walk, with our own walk of faith, the way we live. I want to, go ahead, Marilyn.
The issue of the bread sort of just really hit me. What is it that Jesus breaks during the Last Supper?
Right.
So bread isn't just Wonder Bread we can get at the store or whatever. It has a whole deeper meaning to it.
Yes, that's definitely one of those words that conveys a lot of different chords and connections, and we will be going into that for sure. But you're right, and that's what this prayer is full of those words that are evocative that way and point us back to the tradition that we might have our present and our future illuminated. As a way of kind of getting into the bigness, though, of one of those words, and the word is holiness, I want to look at the Leviticus 19 passage. It's not the only time or the only way that holiness is discussed, but it is a very powerful and fairly succinct. It's 35 verses or so, 36, but it really gets into some of this. And given what we've already talked about, I really think it'll be a lot of good connections made to see this. So let's take a look at Leviticus 19, and I'm going to ask for some volunteers here to kind of just read it as we go. Let's just try to do a couple paragraphs each. And would someone, I can't see faces now that we're on this, would someone be willing to start us? We're going to read the whole chapter here.
Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I am the Lord your God am holy. You shall each revere your mother and father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Do not turn to idols or make cast images of yourselves. I am the Lord your God.
Thank you. You can each read a couple paragraphs if you'd like, because it'll mean that less readers. Would you mind keep going, Carol?
Sure. When you offer a sacrifice of well-being to the Lord, offer it in such a way that it is acceptable in your behalf. It shall be eaten on the same day you offer it, or on the next day, and anything left over until the third day shall be consumed in fire. If it is eaten at all on the third day, it is an abomination. It will not be acceptable. All who eat it shall be subject to punishment, because they have profaned what is holy to the Lord, and any such person shall be cut off from the people. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God.
Thank you. Another reader, please.
You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not steal, and you shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. You shall not revile the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. With justice shall you judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord.
Thank you. Next reader, please.
You shall not hate in your heart anyone of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your animals breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed. Nor shall you put on a garment made of two different materials.
Okay, next reader.
If a man has sexual relations with a woman who is a slave designated for another man, but not ransomed or given her freedom, an inquiry shall be held. They shall not be put to death, since she has not been freed. But he shall bring a guilt offering for himself to the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, a ram as guilt offering. And the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of guilt offering before the Lord for his sin that he committed. And the sin he committed shall be forgiven him. When you come into the land and plant all kinds of trees for food, then you shall regard their fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden to you, it must not be eaten. In the 4th year, all their fruit shall be set apart for rejoicing in the Lord. But in the 5th year, you may eat of their fruit, that their yield may be increased for you. I am the Lord your God.
And I think, we'll need 2 more readers. So starting with 26.
You shall not eat anything with its blood. You shall not practice augury or witchcraft. You shall not round off the hair on your temples or mar the edges of your beard. You shall not make any gashes in your flesh for the dead, or tattoo any marks upon you. I am the Lord. Do not profane your daughter by making her a prostitute, that the land not become prostituted and full of depravity. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Do not turn to mediums or wizards. Do not seek them out to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. You shall not rise before the aged. You shall rise before the aged and defer to the old, and you shall fear your God. I am.
Great. And last one, starting with 33.
When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizens among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. You shall not cheat in measuring length, weight, or quantity. You shall have honest balances, honest weights, and honest ephah, and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall keep all my statutes and all my ordinances and observe them. I am the Lord.
Phew. Okay, it was relatively short. I didn't say it was short. And I know there's a lot of stuff in there. And we're not going to get into the specific statutes and stuff because we could go down that rabbit hole. But where I want us to focus today is just in general, what were some of the things, how would you summarize what the ultimate, the concerns were here? What were you seeing come through in what this was communicating about how we live, how we embody holiness? And again, we don't just be holy because for our sake. Why are we holy? Because God is holy. So these things that God is asking of us, we do because God did them first. Okay, there's that connection that our holiness expresses our reverence. Our practice of this type of stuff expresses our reverence to God. It hallows God's name. So what are some of the concerns that you heard come through there? Carol?
Well, everything that was mentioned is not just for you. All of the things he talked about is communal.
Yeah, almost all of them. You're right. There's some aspects there that we could nitpick and we could go through. Yeah, talking about tattoos and beards and hair and different things. And again, that's a bit of a different conversation. The priests were concerned about some of these things. Okay, this is a very priestly, ritualized language. That's why you see "I am the Lord your God" repeated so much. You can almost envision this being recited at some point. But it's not just about the recitation aspect of it. It's really about reaffirming constantly. Why are we doing these things? Because I am the Lord your God. I am the Holy One who is modeling for you what holiness might look like. What are some other things that came through? Bob?
Dan, I have a question about, there was one line that said, don't be partial to the poor.
Yeah. Don't just be partial to them because they're how to say it. It's to care for them, but to care for all your neighbors. We're not only caring for the poor. It's certainly an area of concern, but it's not to just say only them. It's about this idea of justice being for all of us to share equally. So it's not just, it's not only focusing on them. There is a preference for them though. But yeah, I saw that too. Does that answer it, Bob?
Yes. I suspected that's what it meant, but yeah. I'm glad you clarified.
I loved that one reference to the plowing of the fields and don't plow to the edges. And why is that?
Gleaning. So some left over for the poor.
Yes, it's a way of providing for those that otherwise that don't so-called own the land, but that they can go and get what they need as well. And all that, some of the other stuff, look, there's a lot about, agriculture, horticulture, all this stuff, but these things are what come through strongly, this way of caring and how we revere and even fear God. The word fear means sort of revere, to respect. We respect God as we respect one another. We respect God as we try to model our lives based on what God thinks is important. That sounds obvious. It should sound obvious. But the challenge is, and this prayer puts it right in front of us, how easily we sort of dismiss certain parts or put circles around things or push off. I'm not judging that. We have to do that. Okay. There's aspects of this that we just can't make. It's hard to relate to. Some of the stuff that we just read, it's not easy to relate to. Some of it seems very contextual for the culture, but there's bigger picture stuff that's coming through here. Okay, the way of relating to one another, the way of caring for one another is a way of communicating care for God. That's clear. And in the same way, the language that this passage uses is that God's holiness and the way we convey our respect of God's holiness, how we hallow God's name, is by paying attention to these types of things. That's what hallowing looks like. Daniel.
Our family, mother and father, teach us how to live. In this, what I got out of all of that was our Holy Father was teaching us how to live with all those statements. And in that respect, it's not a male father, it's anybody.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's a great point. It's not a designation here that refers to that sort of parental, literal figure here, but that provider. That's the sense, is all of that stuff, if you take just in general, all that stuff that we talked about has to do with providing enough so that everyone will have enough, that everyone will be nourished in the bodily ways, but also with the respect and the care and the love and the interaction, the relationship, the fairness. Those things are crucial and very important to God. That's where in the first class we talked about this idea of distributive justice. Okay, that all will have enough, okay, because there is enough and God provided enough. There's abundance in our world. So that's what God's intention is, that all might have enough, that all would be fed. I saw other hands. Yes, Horty.
When Dan was speaking in the terms of our mother and father and family teach us behaviors, what came up for me really strongly was the fathering that I've received within this church community. And Dan is one of those people who has showed me how to behave towards others and towards the community.
Receive that blessing, Dan, and know that Horty's not the only one who sees you specifically that way. And I think we could take an entire class to look at each one of us in the eye and in the heart and call those same blessings out. We used to do that in confirmation class because, as kids of teenage years often don't think of themselves in those terms, as being blessed or a blessing. So we used to literally go around and look at each other and tell them what the ways that we saw them, how they blessed us, each one of us, how we experienced them. And it was powerful. Whether we're kids or whether we're adults, we don't get to talk like that too much. But I do think that to speak like that, like you just did, in a tender way of heart speak, that is so crucial to embodying some of these practices. This isn't just rote practice. This isn't just like, all right, I got my list of to-do things. No, this is about a way of being in the world and with one another. It's a way of seeing one another because God sees us, of really knowing one another because God deeply knows us. This is what's called for. So sometimes when we read Leviticus and we read some of these other things, we can get caught up in the lists and in the somewhat feeling rigidity of these lists. But truly, this is way more than those things. It's more about this freeing of our spirit, of our hearts, of our perception to who we really are in the world. And what Horty just named in that little instant, that little interchange, I think speaks more about what's important, about who we are and how we interact and how we impact one another. That captures what we're talking about in this entire class. If I could highlight that, for the people who are watching this, I'd want people to really just note what that felt like, even, and how that opens us up as to just the way we live our lives, the way we approach each day. Often on our to-do list is not to do that, to talk like that, to find someone and see them and speak and meet heart to heart. Spouses, after we're married for a certain number of years, and it might not take that long, we rarely even look at each other that way anymore. It's too easy to get caught up in all the other stuff. To me, this prayer is one way of drawing us back into the things that are essential and most important, and that way of truly seeing, of truly being with one another, is one way we manifest our reverence for God, who is truly and deeply with each one of us. You see how this connects. You see how this continues to open up, to unfold, and I hope break our hearts wide open. Boyce?
I keep going back to that little verse that God is love. And I see that list as acts of love, of how we are to behave. And it's not an all-inclusive list, but it certainly is a long list. Yeah. But I just feel that that's the whole sum of the Bible. Behave with love. Yeah. And act with love. And that person that wrote that is saying, here are acts of love that you must do.
Yeah, and that's truly what it's trying. It's priestly language, but it's communicating that these are acts of love. These are acts of reverence, of care. First John in the New Testament has that famous passage, that says kind of what you just said. God is love, and those who do not love do not know God. So it's never just about me and my relationship with God. Again, it's not that it's not about that. That's important. It's just not ultimate. Our personal connection with God is important. I'll say that, but it's not ultimate. It's not where we fully experience what love looks like, of what faith looks like, of what it lives like, because that's what this is about. It's not just something for here. It's for something for here. Horty?
In the Buddhist tradition, there's a lot of discussion about the difference of living in your hermitage on the hilltop, where you can really have some really exquisite highs, but then being drawn back into the valley of humanity, where we do stumble and fall and make mistakes, and that what we're called to do is then get back up and do it again. And to retreat to the place where we need to retreat, which may be our personal relationship with God, where we become refilled with reverence, but then to go into the valley of humanity and the cosmos and the world that we've been given to live in, to, again, always stumble and fall.
Yes.
And to learn another lesson. And it may be the same lesson over and over and over. I certainly do that myself. Oh, I thought I got that one, but I don't.
Mm-hmm.
But that traverse between retreat and engagement.
Yeah, that's in Buddhism, that's the Eightfold Path. And we repeat, like you said, we cycle through these, we live these things, and we experience the messiness of relationship, that we might more deeply appreciate the purity of connection with God. And then we put ourselves in position to be, as you said, refilled or refreshed, not for our own sake, but so that we might go again into those places of messiness, of unpredictability and adventure, and to be what is necessary, or not, to learn, in those places. Marilyn?
One of the verses that really spoke to me, because it's so relevant for what's going on in this country, was the one about aliens.
Sure.
And that just really reminded me how all of this can be said very simply, but to really do it, to really carry it out, can be not so easy.
Yeah, and that's just the modern manifestation of that. Mm-hmm. So we're not just talking about immigrants from Mexico, but how about when we came over to this country? We were the aliens. Mm-hmm. Okay, and it's like but we kind of shaped it differently, disregarded certain things, but then, throughout the history of this country, and again, history of the world, this is not just pointing fingers at America, but this is our context. But yeah, when you had different immigrants come over through the 18th and 19th century, you had people treated in very different ways and very poorly. Mm-hmm. Because of being sort of an alien, that thing. So yes, this is the challenge, is to look at these and recognize within ourselves where we continue to struggle and grapple and fall down. And that, this is what our faith is asking of us, is not just about staying in our little sequestered, safe spaces, but to really look deeply at these hard issues, mm-hmm. and then consider how are we embodying what is most important, based on not even the codes and the structures of our particular time and government, but what about this, if we say we are following God, what does God have to say, if anything, about this? That's not always easy. I get it. Not always easy to tell. But this is the invitation to be in that space, to be in that sort of modeling, to align ourselves with that heart as best we can. That gives us our best orientation. Go ahead, Bob.
So that part about not eating food after 3 days, at first I was thinking of that's a health issue, but maybe it's meant to be share your food and not try to consume it to that extent.
Or hoard it.
Well, for whatever it might be, I think it definitely conveys multiple levels, and that's it. And I think that could be part of it. It's certainly a reference to the manna story in the wilderness. It might refer to the fact that we don't encourage hoarding, because hoarding makes it difficult to do what's being asked here. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to go, but it's communicating something like that. Don't get caught up in what we often get caught up in. And that might not mean don't prepare for the future. Just don't spend all your time focusing on that. Don't make that the most ultimate thing. That's hard to do. But yeah, that the overall feel, the general sense, and go back to it, read it again. It communicates a lot about what it looks like to live in community and to live in a community of care. And ultimately, if we are going to revere God's name, the holiness of God, it means to embody something in this life and in this world, that the way we live matters, that the way we treat each other matters, and that we hallow God when we live the way God, envisions for our world. Boyce and then Horty.
I agree with you in many of your sermons about fear. In our fear, we chuck aside love or chuck aside God's teachings. And I think this past year we have learned that a lot, how we hoarded toilet paper.
Oh, yeah.
What that resulted in.
Yeah.
And everything that's happened this last year, our fear of this disease, how it changed our behavior throughout the world. And even still, we're trying to figure out, well, whose fault was it that this came to us? And there's all kinds of theories going on about that. But it kind of brings it home. What happened to God's love?
Yeah, well, fear in that sense reveals a lot for us, and we did get to see, in some instances, where we really put our stock sometimes. But it's a fair point. But in this case, fear is a good teacher too. If as long as we're not giving fear the ultimate power, then it can really open us to how the way things really are might be different than the way we say they are or we long for them to be.
Well, how quickly we forget also.
This is true. Horty, you'd had your hand up?
Taking it to a really selfish and personal level, it said to me, don't make so many leftovers.
As long as you're not throwing them out. But yeah, if you do have leftovers, I guess after 3 days, you got to chuck them. Okay.
Don't prepare them, or within the second day, give them away. Don't hoard them because they go bad. Anything you hold on to too long can fester. And so find a neighbor, a friend who may have had a really busy day, and ask if you can bring dinner.
Now we might smile at the simpleness of that example, but really what she's saying is look for ways to be connected to those around you. And food is certainly one of the staples, and we know this is sort of who we are as the church on the hill, the church that feeds one another. But yes, this is good. And the deeper connection there, how it connects us to our neighbor, that we might see and know them in their need and in their identity. Last thing I want to get to, because I know this is going longer, that the burning bush story that I promised we'd get to. I'm not going to read it now because I was going to focus on the simple part where, it's the bush that's both burning and not being consumed. So it's really paradoxical in this image. And then when Moses, and God says, God introduces God's self, and Moses is like, well, what should I call you? And this is such a big moment. And so God answers the whole, well, I am who I am, something like that. Your translations might be somewhat different, but I am who I am, which is a very fascinating way to respond, because it's almost like saying something and nothing at the same time. It's like an unnameable name. And I think there's intention there. So at the first, God gives Moses a name that is paradoxical. It's a name and not a name at the same time. And then when you read the story, and if you look at Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 to 15, and a little bit, around there, you see that God gives more than that and sort of says, here's another name for me. I am the God of your ancestors. I'm the God of your liberation now, and I'm the God of the promised land later. And that's something that's so crucial, because it opens up to us, why is naming important? Okay. Naming is important for multiple reasons. First, the first name of God conveys this. It is an almost impossible task to try to name God. Okay. But we're going to go for it. But the first name of God is still an unnameable name. And that's important to remember as we fall into the traps, or we see around us people falling into the traps of claiming this is what God is and this is only what God is. Beyond all the names we have for God is this first unnameable, beyond our description kind of name that keeps us humble. It keeps us in, I think, proper relationship. And I think that's why the story conveys it the way it does, is that there's this sense that God is always bigger than our capability of naming. So don't get stuck trying to delineate and define God. Focus on describing God, that's fine. Describing doesn't limit, definition limits. We try to define God too often. So the naming story of this burning bush story really does communicate some of that paradox, some of that powerful, unknowable, beyond our language kind of naming, okay? But then to go more than that secondary type of naming that we see in God as liberator, God as promiser, God as provider, God as father, God as rock, God as shepherd, God, all the stuff, okay, that we see. That's secondary names. But they all describe something that's important to God. And that's important to pay attention to too, because those are how God acts in the world. And that's where we can model ourselves. I don't know about you. I have a hard time modeling my life and how I act after an unnameable name. I am who I am. It orients me somewhat, but it more disorients me. And I think that's exactly the point. There is always a tension between the God that is beyond in the heavens and outside of our capability to describe and to name and to define and all that stuff, and yet the God who comes to us, who chooses us, who embodies reality for us, who is within us, who's in our breathing, who was manifest in our presence in the form of Jesus. This God, it is always a tension. It's not one or the other, it's always both. And this prayer is trying to say that. It's not one or the other. It's not just about God, where God and what God's doing. It's not just about us and where we are and what we're doing. It's about that enmeshing, that relationship, that communion that is always a part, that we often forget, that we ignore, that we resist. This prayer is inviting us to stay in that liminal, that numinous space, that space that's beyond and within our comprehension. Comments? Ken and then Pete.
Our English translation of the prayer, Our Father who art in heaven, sounds like a specific place, but the original Greek speaks of the heavens, which is all around us.
Yes, that's a great point. Yeah, heaven is not meant to be this specific place, but it really is meant to convey. And again, in that worldview, their parlance, their awareness, their stories, we're all enmeshed in this sense of heavens being all around, so it did change. You had the ancient Near Eastern view, and then it moved through the Hellenistic years, and it does change. But this idea of heavens was definitely this broad, like everything else outside of maybe this sort of earthly sphere. It's just this huge space. Okay, so it wasn't meant to ever convey something sort of too localized. And Pete?
I've been perseverating on hallowed be thy name.
and the fact that we cannot name God. And it occurred to me during our discussion of what our names are, you know, like Carol Wells, Carol Williams.
Yeah.
That to name someone, particularly someone, but also something, in my experience, limits it.
Mm-hmm.
And to look for the essence is an exercise not of the brain, but of the heart. And to feel the at one-ment with everything is not, it can't, there's no name for it. There's no naming it. And for me personally, the pursuit of a name has been frustrating.
Yeah.
So to feel it and to know it in that way has been a much greater blessing for me.
Yeah. And I think that's where it's hoping to point us beyond, not to say look, we can struggle with language. It's okay. We can grapple with these things. That's the name of Israel. Remember, the name Israel means to wrestle with faith, to wrestle with God. Okay, so wrestling is an important part. So we can get in there, we can go to these places, but don't get stuck in that one place. And this text, this prayer is inviting us to that deeper, broader space that's beyond, maybe some of the typical ways we think of what naming means, but more into something larger. And the truth is, pay attention to the way you use language. And notice when your words, especially when they're directed at someone else, but let's be honest, they're often in our self-speak too, the words we say to ourselves, the way they either limit or liberate, the way they either define or describe, the way they might set someone and knock them off and down, or they might lift someone up. Okay, so there's so many possibilities. There's so much power in the way we use our words and our naming. So it's all there, and that's what's so, that's why it's hard to do this kind of class. That's why I was like, this class could take 45 minutes, or we could keep going for 4 hours. And I don't know, anyone that's watching this is probably like, oh my gosh, I'm probably going to wrap this up. And I'm sorry if that's how you feel, but that's not how I feel. I love this. I could talk for 4 hours. But anyway, we're gonna be finishing up soon. I see Horty, and then I'll get to anyone else.
I've always had a deep reverence for the ancient Jewish concept that God could not be named. That it was a sound that could not be spoken. That they used Yahweh as a representation, but it was beyond anything that we could even possibly conceive to name. And I think that was the manifestation, at least for me in my memory of it, the manifestation of the struggle that we're talking about. How do you name, how do you describe that which is such a cellular piece of our essence, and is also in, of, and about the heavens? That ability to name and not name. But then you named it too in the I am that I am. It's unnameable.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think that story is just so brilliant and so powerful, is because it names God first in with respect to what you just said and what Pete said. And that is that God can't be named. So we dare not. And as humans who are seeking and striving and wrestling to live this out, having some descriptors is so crucial, because we need to be taught how to live in relationship with one another. And so that's what those names do. They describe God. They help us access something that otherwise might just be beyond, and then we could get stuck. Okay, so it's real sort of a compassionate way that God invites, when you read that story, the Exodus chapter 3 story of Moses in the bush, it really is that sort of way that God sort of caringly moves through this with Moses. Says, well, this is my name, but you can also tell them this. And this describes me, because I'm the God who was, who is, and who shall be. I'm the God of your ancestors. I'm the God of your liberation, and I'm the God of the promise. You know, these things are so rich, and in some ways are limiting, but they really are also very broadening. They open it up to a deeper appreciation. You know, that's what God's name is justice. God's name is fairness. God's name is care and consideration for those who have been marginalized. These things, okay, again, descriptors, but they're all there. They're all there. So this prayer is inviting us into all of that, into all that consideration. So you got a lot to chew on this week.
And if indeed Israel means struggle with God, aren't we all named Israel?
Amen. Amen. Boys, you want to take us home?
Sure, you can all come over.
Nice. Way to embody it, Boyce.
I'm kind of considering that God does have a first name, and it's very inclusive and complete, and doesn't eliminate anything. We pray, our Father, our God. I think his first name is Our.
Okay, that wasn't as bad as I thought it might be. No, but there's something beautiful there. As long as our is that way of not being possessive our, but just that open our, like all, like what Barbara was saying, that our not just for humanity, but our in terms of all that is. Okay.
And was and then will be.
And will be, yes. To live with that spirit of reverence and deep connection, just feel how that shifts your perceptions of the meaning of your life and your place in things in your day. Just pay attention, and maybe we'll come back to that next time. But I just want to say thank you all. I don't want to cut anyone off, but thank you all. This has been a rich class, and for all those who have watched, I hope you found it to be as rich as it has been for us. But as always, thank you for your hearts and your minds and your whole selves that you bring to this class, because it helps me to do the same.
Once again, it's beyond the beyond, Dan. Thank you so much.
Amen. Mm-hmm. All right, everyone. So until next time, we'll meet again next week. Be well.
Thank you.
Happy Easter.